Hello there, you awakening wonders. Welcome to Stay Free with Russell Brand. Thank you so much for joining us. The first 15 minutes of the show will be available on YouTube, then will be exclusively on Rumble. Today we're talking about, well, Nazis actually. What is a Nazi and what isn't a Nazi? Is a Nazi a member of the Nazi party being applauded in Canada? Are declared Nazis Nazis, or are Nazis people that are just called Nazis for various reasons? Also, we're going to be talking to Dr. Robert Epstein about the phenomenal power of Google and their ability to manipulate the public sphere and conversation in ways that are just staggering. You're going to want to see that. And to start us off, we're going to be talking about just ordinary, typical corruption. Democrat US Senator Bob Menendez and his wife have been charged in a bribery inquiry that's real old school, gold bullion, James Bond style villainous corruption. Let's have a look.
New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez and his wife indicted by a federal grand jury. The senator is accused of using his office to help several businessmen from New Jersey, as well as the Egyptian government, in exchange for receiving hundreds.
Does sound like a sort of 80s Bruce Willis film, the Egyptian government, business people from New Jersey. What's, I suppose, most troubling about this is that it's not surprising at all, is it? Don't you just expect people in Congress and the Senate to be taking bribes? Isn't it just understood at this point that this is their function? That all we have here is a more overt and slightly more comical example of what is institutionally true. I mean, how far along the gradient is this type of corruption from the ordinary donations and lobbying and ordinary framing of the political obligations of senators and Congress people everywhere, and our understanding that these people are not representatives of common interests or popular interests. They are simply in the service of elite establishment agenda. And when some gold bullion turns up, or a briefcase full of money, or an envelope full of dirty cash, it simply serves as a more poetic and easily understandable example of something we all know to be true anyway.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars in gifts, including cash, a luxury vehicle, even gold bars.
The gold bars was when they were running out of ways to bribe him. Here's some gifts, some cash, a luxury vehicle. How about actual just gold? There we go. Ow! Don't throw that thing, it's heavy. The kind of ridiculous, overt cartoon corruption that offers us a readable symptom of how the establishment operates. They claim moral authority, but actually this is what they're about. But in this instance, there is a plain distinction between what they claim to be and what they actually are. Look at them. Suits, ties, dressed up, the rhetoric of politics, and behind the scenes, gold bars. No transparency, no clarity, evident and obvious corruption.
It accuses the senator of accepting cash and gifts, including, as you mentioned, gold bars, a luxury Mercedes-Benz vehicle, in exchange, and they call it bribery, for taking official action to benefit the people that were paying him the money.
Yeah, I know how bribery works. What, you mean you give me that gold bar and then I say stuff in the Senate that's beneficial? You're a genius. I'm glad we got you on the team.
Separate arrangements. There was an Egyptian figure who had a halal meat business that got an exclusive deal to provide halal meat to the government of Egypt, even as Senator Menendez had significant influence over foreign U.S. military.
Do you know what I like? Halal meat. You guys should be eating more halal meat. Aren't we in the middle of a culture war against presumed Islamic interests? That's us maybe, but you gotta try this halal to believe it. Look at how the legacy media take the opportunity to present this as a sort of outlier, that this is somehow distinct from the kind of corruption that is actually institutional. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment.
Sales and military aid to Egypt. And the indictment details a series of allegations where they say Senator Menendez exerted that influence and pressured Egyptian officials even as he was helping this company. And then separately, it says that the senator intervened in two separate criminal matters involving his associates, trying to stop essentially the criminal investigations into those people in exchange for financial compensation in the form of bribes. And what's so shocking about this, Anna, is it's coming just 6 years after Senator Menendez narrowly escaped conviction in a separate and unrelated corruption case. There was a hung jury. The Justice Department decided not to retry him, and he was admonished by the Senate Ethics Committee for taking gifts and luxury items from a friend of his in exchange for official action.
You can't get enough of it, can he, old Menendez? He loves a bribe, plainly. But how is this significant case of overt, almost comedic bribery distinct from these examples of corruption that you would have to regard as institutional? From the world of energy, at least 100 members of Congress own fossil fuel stocks, of which 59 are Republicans and 41 are Democrats. So there you go. That's an example, I would say, of corruption that's accepted and legal. Pharma, of the $263 million that the pharmaceutical industry spent on lobbying in 2021, it gave 61% to the Democrat Party and 39% to the Republican Party. Again, a type of corruption and bias that is, in a sense, far more influential, impactful, and yet legal. Banking. In 22, commercial banks spent over $30 million lobbying Congress, 61% to the Republicans and 39% to the Democrats. Notice again how both wings of the parliamentary or congressional system are beholden to the same interests, meaning that whoever you vote for, you're voting for a party that is paid for by these types of interests, whether it's banking or big pharma or the military-industrial complex or the energy industry. Nearly 20% of Congress members, 49 Democrats and 44 Republicans, have been trading shares of companies in industries they are supposed to be overseeing as part of their committee assignments. Compared to that, Menendez just looks like a sort of old school, corrupt, like mayor of Springfield type politician, rather than an institutionally corrupt and more invasive political operator. Defense. The Pentagon spent $14 trillion after 9/11. 55% of it went to for-profit defense contractors. That's one of the big ones, isn't it? It just shows how an entire nation is formulated around this type of corruption. Military contractors have spent $2.5 billion on lobbying over the past 2 decades. They split their checks more or less evenly between Democrat and Republican candidates. Soon after the Ukraine war broke out last year, Congress voted to appropriate $40 billion in aid to Ukraine. Every single Democrat voted for it. 40 Republicans urged Joe Biden to include a 5% increase in defense spending in his 2023 US budget. So this obvious example of corruption really just gives us an opportunity to look at institutional corruption. All dear old Bob Menendez really did a bit of atavistic, old school, nostalgic corruption instead of the more slick corruption that passes for ordinary government these days. In a way, what stories like this demonstrate is a lack of moral authority and integrity at the heart of our systems, whether they are media, state, institutional, governmental, judicial. We already know that's the case, and sometimes you get an obvious, glaring, and almost comedic example of that, like when a Nazi is honoured in the ultra-liberal and progressive, according to their own declarations, Canadian Parliament. Let's have a look at that in more detail and look at how the term Nazi is used to shut down dissent and debate when actual Nazism appears to be literally celebrated in Parliament. Here's the news? No, here's the effing news.
Thank you for choosing Fox News.
No, here's the fucking news.
The establishment and the legacy media are certain that there are Nazis and fascists everywhere, particularly when people oppose their agenda. But they're also willing to applaud and fund actual Nazis. Does this mean that we live in a truly nihilistic time with no truthful moral center in any of our establishment institutions? Surely you have noticed that terms like Nazi and fascist are used profligately to describe anyone who opposes the agenda of the establishment. And yet we find curious contradictions when we look at the funding of the ongoing war. We find peculiar anomalies when an actual Nazi is applauded in Canadian Parliament when Zelenskyy recently visited. Does this mean that terms like Nazi and fascist have lost their tethering, have lost their root, have lost their grounding because we live in a kind of nihilistic time where language is used in order to create narratives that are beneficial and to shut down opposition? Are we able to have honest, moral conversations about righteousness and justice anymore anyway? Who has true moral authority? Who do we look to now to determine what is right, what is wrong, what is just and unjust? A few examples of this from recent times, of course, are the profligate and sometimes casual use of terms like Nazi and fascist, with establishment politicians willing to label their opponents as fascists and Nazis simply as a means to shut them down. Let's have a look at those terms now, because if you fund actual explicit Nazis in the ongoing war, that's not to say that the Ukrainian cause is not just, or that Ukrainians are more broadly Nazi. Of course it isn't. It's just a reference to the actual Nazi battalion that are funded as a result of this war and the complexities of this war. And let's have a look at this extraordinary incident where a real-life, genuine, actual swastika-wearing Nazi was applauded on the eve of Yom Kippur, and ask, where is moral authority now? And how are we all suffering as a result of the loss of this genuine moral center?
I remember as a young student, trying to figure out, how did people get basically drawn in by Hitler? How did that happen? And I'd watch newsreels and I'd see this guy standing up there ranting and raving and people shouting and raising their arms. I thought, what's happened to these people? Why did they believe that?
Well, some of them are in Canada, being applauded in Parliament.
You saw the rally in Ohio the other night. Trump is there ranting and raving for more than an hour, and you have these rows of young men with their arms raised. I thought, what is going on?
Okay, so there's an obvious attempt to equate supporters of Trump with Nazis, a literal, apparent and observable attempt to do just that. Now put aside your own preferences for a moment and think about what the meaning of Nazism is in a contemporary context. Does it mean fascism? Does it mean genocidal policies? Does it mean racism? Certainly any Nazi worthy of the term would have to be racist and genocidal, I would say, as a bare minimum. How is it that this term continues to be used, and what is the function of this term? Is it simply to shut down conversation? Is it to delegitimize opposition? Because if the term Nazi can be applied indiscriminately, or at least conveniently, don't we have to look at Nazis that are declared explicit and obvious, and inconvenient Nazis that might be funded by the very establishment that are attempting to use that term to shut down conversation?
So there is a real pressure, and I think it is fair to say we're in a struggle between democracy and autocracy.
Now, of course, Hillary Clinton stands for a particular type of neoliberalist politics that ultimately supports the same financial interests that were ultimately in charge during the Bush-Cheney era, and yet uses the rhetoric of progressivism when it's convenient. Another political figure that is aligned with those ideals, but also, I would argue, and let me know in the chat and the comments if you agree, quite oppressive when it comes to protest and free speech. Take, for example, the Canadian trucker movement, is Justin Trudeau. I suppose what we're proposing here is there is the rhetoric of liberalism and freedom, and yet the behaviour of authoritarianism. Certainly we are not accusing people that we disagree with ideologically of being Nazis, because that is the kind of simplistic, reductive discourse that we need to move beyond. What we're pointing out is there doesn't seem to be any moral centre in any of our establishment institutions, whether that's the media, the government, the corporate world or the judiciary, that allows us to freely trust their moral position. That's why you have people that support their opponents dismissed as Nazis, and actual Nazis, as in this clip, applauded in Parliament. Not to mention the complexity that we referred to earlier, where the Azov battalion continue to be funded by your taxpayer dollars. So what is a Nazi really?
A standing ovation for a Ukrainian veteran of the Second World War,
who fought the Ukrainian independence against the Russians and continues to support the troops today, even at his age of 98.
In a sense, the mathematics, geography and history could have been looked at before the decision to honour that gentleman, who may well have been brave, but it has to be said, was a brave Nazi. And suddenly we're in some very complex moral territory. In an attempt to assume righteous posturing, Nazis are being applauded. Opponents are being shut down for being Nazis. I mean, this is Canada, where the trucker movement were dismissed as Nazis, shut down, their free speech was controlled because they were alleged to be Nazis for no real actual reason, and yet a member of the Nazi party has just been celebrated in Parliament. Now, obviously, this was an error and a mistake, but what it shows me, and I wonder if you agree with this, is there is no actual tethering to values and principles anymore. Language is just used, adjudications are used in order to meet a particular agenda, to control the public sphere, to shut down dissent and opposition. This person is a Nazi, that person's a Nazi, but what about these Nazis? We're funding those Nazis. What about this Nazi? We're applauding that Nazi. What this shows me is there's a kind of nihilism at the core of our culture. Our institutions are falling apart from the inside, observably. And this kind of peculiar moral morass is the observable symptom of a system that has no moral core.
Invited by House Speaker Anthony Rota to witness Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's address to Parliament, Yaroslav Hunka is one of his constituents.
He's a Ukrainian hero, a Canadian hero, and we thank him for all his service.
Ukrainian hero, a Canadian hero, a Nazi hero. The world's getting so complicated. Plainly, this is a ridiculous error, but it's also a window into the hollow, empty rhetoric that passes for politics these days. And this is what happens when nothing means anything anymore. When there's a locked-on agenda that has to be pursued, and justice can be discarded, meaning can be discarded, rights can be discarded, free speech can be discarded. Suddenly it's plausible that bank accounts can be shut down, people's financial lives, private lives can all be used as pieces on a chessboard that always has the same momentum. Centralized authority, shut down debate. That's why you'll notice that any crisis or trauma that's tossed into the machine, whether it's a climate crisis, a health crisis, or an energy crisis, a military crisis, always has the same result. The empowerment and enrichment of an elite and the disempowerment of ordinary people. This paradigm will be repeated endlessly, I predict, until none of us have any power at all.
That was the jubilant scene Friday. Now new details have emerged about that war service MPs applauded. Hunka served in the 1st Galician Division, a voluntary unit commanded by the Nazis.
The unit is complicit in the Holocaust.
This Jewish human rights campaigner says there's no defending former soldiers like Hunka.
You swore allegiance to Hitler, and you were involved with the massacre of civilians.
Rota has now apologized and says he regrets ever inviting him.
In retrospect, I shouldn't have invited a Nazi on Yom Kippur.
I'm afraid I was very drunk.
It seems, I suppose, insensitive is a word. Does that word have any meaning anymore? Does anything mean anything anymore?
I recognize an individual in the gallery. I have subsequently become aware of more information which causes me to regret my decision to do so, he says in a statement. I accept full responsibility for my actions. Still, the opposition is asking how this could happen.
How it happens is no one has any regard for actual values. People care only for spectacle. Just the creation of a spectacle, the creation of some symbols, as long as it's generally moving in the direction of their agenda, they won't question the reality of it. That's how it happens, because there's no earthed connection to reality. This is the cultural space that's being created. This is the cultural space that's being controlled.
The Prime Minister's office says it wasn't aware the Speaker had invited Hunka, saying in a statement, no advance notice was provided to the Prime Minister's office, nor the Ukrainian delegation, about the invitation or the recognition.
And yet they applauded anyway, because they don't have any genuine values. They don't care for the actual truth. They just want to participate in a disempowering spectacle.
Obviously, it's extremely upsetting that this happened. The speaker has acknowledged his mistake and has apologized. But this is something that is deeply embarrassing to the Parliament of Canada and, by extension, to all Canadians. I think particularly of Jewish MPs and all members of the Jewish community across the country who are commemorating Yom Kippur today. I think it's going to be really important that all of us push back against Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation.
What? Russian propaganda? Russian disinformation? Didn't you just have a Nazi in Parliament and applaud him? Are you suggesting that somehow Putin was involved in that? You don't have to be a Putin apologist, and I'm certainly not one, to recognise that this event is not the fault of Vladimir Putin. This is the fault of a morally empty neoliberal establishment that will use symbols to create a narrative without questioning what they're actually doing, because there's no meaning there. There is no meaning there. Just the service of elite interests and the provision of an apparently convenient narrative that, because it's so hollow and vacuous, will occasionally involve applauding Nazis on the eve of Yom Kippur, because they've got no actual values.
And continue our steadfast and unequivocal support for Ukraine as we did last week with announcing further measures to stand with Ukraine in Russia's illegal war against it.
Well, as long as the unequivocal support of Ukraine doesn't similarly involve the support of actual Nazis. And again, you don't have to not be supportive of Ukrainian people or sympathetic to their plight, or indeed pray for an end to this horrific and unnecessary war, to still be able to observe that there is a Nazi battalion being funded by your taxpayer dollars fighting within the Ukrainian army. There is a degree of complexity and nuance which is way beyond the ability of this current system to navigate. Liberals, socialists and other progressives often claim that conservatives are in bed with the far right and Nazis. This repulsive term is sometimes used to describe conservatives themselves. Well, that's just not going to work anymore. The political left can thank Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Liberals for this after they unwittingly honoured a Nazi in Parliament. What an astonishing time it is. This story just one of the indications of how crazy the world has become. Now, obviously, we can't bring you this evidently contentious content without support from our sponsors. That's why I'm incredibly grateful that Sticker Mule, one of the great sponsors of Stay Free with Russell brand, are offering these 6 stunning designs. They're only available in this pack. They're all made with Sticker Mule's magic touch. Sticker Mule has 10,000 of these packs. That's right, 10,000 ready to deliver to your address absolutely free. Just go to stickermule.com/Russell and fill out the form. Thank you, Sticker Mule, for continuing to support our content in an extraordinary time. And thank you, Canada, for being so extraordinary in the people you're willing to honour. Let's get back into that. Anthony Rota, the Speaker of the House, recognised one of his constituents, 98-year-old Yaroslav Hunka, who was honoured during Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's September the 22nd visit. This is because politics is a spectacle now. They realised there's a Ukrainian veteran living in our constituency. Wouldn't it be fantastic to honour this Ukrainian veteran because it will look good and it will feel good, but it won't mean anything except applauding, in this instance, a Nazi. And unless you want to get into the complexity of war, the nature of good and evil, Solzhenitsyn's term that the line between good and evil runs not between nations, continents, races or creeds, but through every human heart, then that looks like an error. And I don't see any willingness to look at Solzhenitsyn's writing work because he's Russian. Rota depicted Hunka as a Ukrainian-Canadian war veteran from the Second World War who fought for Ukrainian independence against the Russians, and also called him a Ukrainian hero, a Canadian hero, and we all thank him for his service. I mean, that's actually a considerable lack of knowledge of the Second World War, where it's commonly understood that Russia, the United States, Britain and others were in alliance against the Nazis. Here's the problem. Hunka served in a unit which was renamed the 1st Ukrainian Division towards the end of the Second World War. That particular division is more well known under its previous names as either the SS Galicia Division or the 14th Waffen Grenadier SS Division. It was a voluntary unit that was under the command of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany and was accused of murdering innocent Jews and Poles. So it was sort of pretty frontline actual Nazism. This is not the kind of Nazism that is used linguistically to condemn opponents of neoliberalist vacuous politics. This is actual execution of innocent people on the basis of their nationality or race. Hunka received a standing ovation in the House. It's on the record. It will always be available on YouTube and other video clips. There's no way for the Trudeau Liberals to ever escape it. Rota and his staff clearly had no idea there was a link between the 1st Ukrainian Division and the Nazis before inviting Hunka. Presumably, or they wouldn't have invited him because PR is their business, honesty and politics isn't. Government House leader Karina Gould also made this post on X on September the 24th. The Speaker has made it clear that he was responsible for inviting this individual to the House. The government played no role. It did not know he would be there. The PM did not meet him. I'm deeply troubled this happened. I urge MPs to avoid politicising this incident. You can't start politicising the Nazis. They were an apolitical organisation. In a sense, they were just hobbyists, really. You shouldn't drag them into the quagmire of the current divisive political debate. And again, what you see is an establishment that cares only about spectacle, not about reality, that has to shut down dissent, that has to use derogatory language and condemnatory terms because there is no centre. There are no values at their core. The same way that they would willingly use a Nazi, they would use other terms for other minority groups and other oppressed groups to leverage and advance other arguments, I believe, in order to cause division and hatred and to mask the fact that there is no ethical centre to any of their actions because they are simply shepherding us towards a globalist, centralised, authoritarian dystopia. And if you want to look at some of our other videos, I've got the receipts for that statement. Here's another fact. A war monument dedicated to the 1st Ukrainian Division was defaced in the St. Vladimir Ukrainian Cemetery in Oakville, Ontario in July 2020. It was originally treated as a hate-motivated incident by police. Jewish groups and human rights advocates were furious, as they are today with the Hunka revelation. The international media covered it from end to end, yet no liberal media made the connection to this Nazi-aligned volunteer unit that was in the news only 3 years ago. so. I suppose that's because of their certainty in their moral position and a lack of true inquiry and journalistic integrity, and a desire simply to push a particular agenda, even when that agenda has inconvenient Nazis in it. Here's yet another fact. The Canadian government's blunder played right into the waiting hands of Vladimir Putin and Russia. Such sloppiness of memory is outrageous, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters. Many Western countries, including Canada, have raised a young generation that does not know who fought whom or what happened during the Second World War, and they know nothing about the threat of fascism. In a sense, this abandonment of history, this abandonment of the memory that there was an alliance between Russia, the United States, the UK, many other countries that stood against Nazism before ideological fissures appeared, is also an obscuring, I believe, of the possibility that peaceful, diplomatic solutions to the current conflict could be reached. That Russia aren't alien and Nazi, in spite of the obvious atrocities associated with Stalinism. It seems that there's a possibility that they are a nation with their own trajectory, their own agenda, even possibly their own imperialism and colonialism. But to imagine that the neoliberal establishment of the United States of America, in particular, doesn't have a comparable agenda is especially naive. And it's by use of terms like Nazis and the shutting down of conversation and the closing down of dissent and the convenient appropriation of symbols that conversations like this are able to be continually avoided when they're the very conversations that are required. To further present the complexity of using a term like Nazi when Nazism continues to be a real thing in the world, here's a few headlines. The Guardian: Azov fighters are Ukraine's greatest weapon. The Azov causes particular concern due to the far-right, even neo-Nazi leanings of many of its members. NBC News: Ukraine's Nazi problem is real. Neo-Nazis are part of some of Ukraine's growing ranks of volunteer battalions. One is the Azov battalion. We mentioned that not to discredit Ukrainian people, not to discredit the right of Ukrainian people to warrant support, but in order to point out that there's a degree of complexity that is seldom handled by mainstream media and establishment politics, because they're not interested in complexity, they're interested in propaganda. Anyone that is interested in complexity is likely to be regarded as a dissenter, a Nazi, or worse, and shut down, because they have no moral authority at their centre. You know that they operate at the service of establishment interests, and that their ideological rhetoric is just scattered across the cultural space to cause distraction, infraction, friction, or conflict, because there is no sense of righteousness. There is no sense of justice. There is no sense of beauty, truth, God. There is no vision for a better future at the core of this establishment. Only managed decline, only managed discontent, only blame and condemnation. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you think in the chat. See you in a second.
Thank you for choosing Fox News.
No, here's the fucking news.
What extraordinary times we're living in, where reality appears to be curated to an enormous degree. How do you manage reality? How do you manage perception? How do you manage information? Joining me now is Dr. Robert Epstein, a former Harvard psychology professor, author of 15 books, and current director of the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology. Thank you very much for joining us today, Doctor.